Fogir poiko per por, chevepir forik rov koi koviboj, kokis rovaik irosoinib. Rov koi koverkor, zorib zoj, kokoyo siwoib, chokis givrojiver kizoinoj kigoj. Chokis por, Fiosherjep Kizoinoj, porco porco kis rov poroj circo. Gifrojiver rov koiko ver kor kigoj. Gefos ek por. Zoj ois rov koikhof por. Cherir Gigifso Kizoinoj. Hey everybody, thanks for coming in today. We're going to be looking at Gigifso Kizoinoj, which is literally translated a practice language. It, like in that order even, because I never got very far. The entire idea was whenever I listened to other conlangers, both on YouTube and whenever I listened to David Peterson, just hearing how many times they made mistakes and how not very proud of their first language they were. Usually because of these mistakes. So I figured I would take a few things that I wanted to do and make a practice language with the express goal of making all the mistakes I could just to get them out of the way, learn a few things, let failure be my tutor. And I think I succeeded, mostly because the biggest failure I had here was failing to finish the language. So this is an incomplete language, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm done with it. With that said, let's get looking at it. First, we'll go and take a look at the phonology. I tried to limit myself a lot so that we can see how difficult it is for me not to include some of my favorite sounds from the IPA. And I failed on that one too because I did not want to have a language without an R or without a rhotic of some kind. So that being said, the current sound inventory is P, B, K, G, R, S, Z, Ch, J, and later J. We'll get to that in a moment. F, V, W, and the glottal stop. The vowels include E, O, I, Oi, and A. Now, the thing is, I actually started with a proto-lang for this and tried to evolve it through a few different reforms for both sounds and spelling. And that's why I mentioned that we'll get to J in a minute. Originally, J actually comes from a cluster for Ch and J being close together. You'll see that here in a minute. The vowels also, Oi and A, also come from this cluster effect after spelling reforms. The syllables are basically, there is a vowel as necessary and a coda in the original language. The onset was not necessary. But in the proto-lang, any single vowel could be in the nucleus position with no diphthongs, and then the coda could be any or could be any voiced consonant unless between two syllables, with the glottal stop always allowed between vowels. On to the sound reforms. Like I said, J is created from the combination of Ch and J, and in places where it would create a form of gemination. The second J is replaced with a glottal stop. Why did I put that in there? I have no clue, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. I guess I was trying to account for any possible combination of letters, but in practice, whenever I started evolving the language, not a single word actually did that. In the second wave of reforms, the glottal stop actually disappears between vowels. There are no diphthongs at this point, but the coda is no longer necessary, so now you can have standalone vowels. In wave 3, E and E form the diphthong A, and J and S can combine to make sh. That only appeared once in the practice that I was doing in the word in the intro, fiosher, but that's not important. I just thought I'd point it out. In wave 4, the glottal stop disappears between consonants, and O and E form the diphthong oi. Wave 5, we see the R starting to create consonants with p, b, f, vr, k, g, s, sh, and j. I really wanted to make sure I could practice making as many different rhotic clusters as possible, even if I didn't do it as much as I would have liked. But I figured it would give me a good chance to just try different sounds that are not present in my everyday speech. In wave 6, we see the W drop from the coda position and replaced with the rhotic again, with the trilled R. In wave 7, the N voiced bilabial becomes voiced after velars. I think there was a word I wanted to make work in my practice and with my translations, and it just seemed fun to do for some reason. Again, I'm not particularly certain why I did that, but actually, you know what? It might have been because of some of the grammar that we'll get to in just a moment. In wave 8, the final wave, words with doubled vowels from earlier versions of the language drop the second vowel. So instead of having an O glottal stop O becoming like a long O, it just becomes a short O. So you see some words that actually lose length in the evolution of a language. Onto the sentence structure. This was intended to be a verb, object, subject language because I figured it was different enough from my native language, which is American English, that it would force me to think in new ways, but still similar enough that I wouldn't lose complete track whenever I was building the translations for literally anything. That's about where it begins to fall apart, however. I wanted to make the language ergative absolutive as well because that is, again, different enough from English that I thought it would make me think differently. But I never made verb cases except for the dative case for indirect verbs, which was to drop the final consonant and add "-es" at the end of it. I never used it, however, as far as I got with this language while you're seeing it. And to be honest, I started to create the language and then took about a month off, came back to it, and lost track of everything that I was doing. About the only useful thing that came out of that first session was defining noun classes. And even then, it got very little use outside of definitive articles. In this case, you see the noun classes are human, animal, and everything else. And their definitive articles in this case are zoj, zij, and zeb. Next, in ways I never actually finished working on the language, is word order. I knew I wanted the genitive to come before the noun, the adjective before the noun, the adposition before the noun, and the relative clause before the noun. I also knew I wanted adverbs to come before verbs. What I didn't think about was how to actually make them all work together. I don't know what order they're supposed to appear in, so I guess if they ever show up, I'll just do it in whatever order I want. Moving on from there, we see that I also worked on pronouns. Now, I knew for a fact I wanted to make sure that pronouns were neutral in terms of gender or sex or literally anything else. It is just saying this particular instance of a person. In that sense, we have the first person, Paul, the second person, Cho, and the third person, Keeg. We do not have anything for plurals, though, even though I had meant to actually do something with plurals at some point. But, as you see, the second person pronoun is only used for humans. That's right, if you want to talk to a very specific dog, you would use the third person pronoun because they are not a human and therefore are not deserving in this language, I guess. I never actually made a culture, but they do not have the same status as humans. From there, we move on to where we see I have possession. I'm not sure where I was going with this, because apparently the singular first person for possession is pos, and then you have os for second person singular and es for third person singular. The plurals are poos, oos, and igis. If you notice that, and you remember what I said was going on through the spelling reforms, you'll notice that the plurals for poos, oos, both become os. I didn't plan that part out very well. I don't think I ever gave it a second thought. I don't think I've ever looked at it, much less decided to use it. I'm befuddled by what I had going on there. One thing I knew I wanted to play with was changing the type of speech that a particular word could be. Noun to verb, verb to noun, and so on. What I ended up working on was a system by which you could change them out just by adding a suffix that I think actually worked out pretty well, relatively speaking. For instance, we have a noun to verb construction by adding os as a suffix to the end of the noun. a verb to noun where you add eb to the end of the verb root, and a verb to adjective where you add so to the end of the verb root. We also have a system of negation, which I suppose could be both verbal and noun based. In that case, you just add rof to the beginning of the word, just as a prefix. We do see that actually a couple times in the introduction that I gave you, where instead of, because the base word in that case actually means a success, and the word ended up morphing from a success to a failure, but using the construction for negation. I think that part actually turned out pretty decently, all things considered, and that's one of the few things that I'm proud of with this language, because again, I dropped it for a month and then came back and just started adding things, and that adding things part is what apparently is one of the biggest mistakes people usually make. I did know that because I was starting with a proto-lang and trying to evolve it naturalistically, that I also wanted to see if I can come up with a couple of semi-honorifics. And I say semi because it's not very formal. It's mostly a colloquial thing between friends or talking about people that you know and that you have some measure of respect for. The first one was supposed to be a replacement for the second person singular pronoun that is derived from old friend. Now that comes off the back of another construction that I actually began, but I never worked with any further, where you just use a word that basically means old or elder whenever you're referring to someone that you respect. And in this case, it's not old as some people would think of it. It's not a derogatory term. It actually means something more like people who have respect or who have knowledge, someone who has been there and has done that. You know, it's a very polite thing. I also wanted to have something that was a little bit more playful in regards to people that you knew, where it was actually a construction based off of the word young in the same sense that old was used with the previous one. The constructions would essentially mirror each other, with young replacing old in every instance, and it's not meant to be derogatory again. This one is very playful, but it's still very respectful. It's like someone who is trying but just isn't there yet, or someone who you see as like a younger sibling, something like that. You still like them, but you're also pointing out that they are inexperienced in some way. Now, there was a derogatory construction I wanted to use that replaced young with infant, and the sense was that this is a person who has not experienced it and still has the sense that they probably are more important that they have. Like the way I translated it in my personal notes was a person who's still wet behind the ears, as we like to say in American English sometimes. The only other construction that I really had, though, the only other colloquialism is for the phrase as if, meaning a way that things take place. And the construction for as if is using the words by the wind. We would think of it as, if we translate it out, as if it were done by the wind. That's actually something that I really enjoyed. I like coming up with that because I did that on the fly when I asked some friends to give me phrases to translate out, and someone thought they were getting one over on me because these were words that were, I told them personally, was a little bit difficult for me to think of. And then I just came up with a thing, and I really enjoyed it. And you'll see the construction here in a minute. But I did want to point out those were the only two things that I knew I wanted to do, was a honorific system and some other types of colloquialisms, and that's as far as I got. Now, before I get into verbs, I want to take a look at numbers. It's just a base 10 system. I wasn't looking to do anything fancy with this one. I just wanted to do base 10 because it was nice, easy, and made sense. And I kind of copied what little bit I understand of what Japanese does. They basically have the numbers 1 through 10, and then everything from 10 to 19 is 10 plus that number, and anything that is a multiple of 10 is that number and 10. So 1 is each, 10 is a ju, 11 is ju each, and 20 is ni ju, and then you continue on like that. I essentially started with that same thing where the proto-lang was 10 and 1, 10 and 2, and so on, and then just let it evolve a little bit. But like I said, I didn't do anything fancy with it. In fact, I only went up to 13 and then was done with it, and I don't even remember why I stopped at 13. I think I just decided That's as far as I was going to go, and just never put any more thought into it. All right, on to everyone's favorite verbs. And yeah, I'm sure if you've ever worked on a conlang before, you understand why I'm saying that with a hint of sarcasm. We all know what we want to do with our verb systems, except in this case, I really didn't have anything more than a couple of basic ideas that, like everything else, never got fleshed out. So let's take a dive. First, I wanted to make sure that verbs would inflect for noun class, for person, and for plurality. And let me tell you, I failed that in a fun way. I think it made it a little bit easier to do, to be completely honest, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted naturalistic, so I'll show you what I mean. First up, for the tenses, I knew I wanted past, present, and future, and I knew I wanted to keep it to a relatively simple tense system for this case. The present tense was supposed to be the root of the verb, which really is just the infinitive version. So I made it a little bit simpler in that way. But I wanted it to be the verb root plus the plus the noun class marker. Now, I never came up with a noun class marker as far as the verbs were concerned. I think the idea was to keep on the class markers for pluralization or maybe the definitive articles. I'm not real sure. As I said, I never made it that far. The past and future tense were basically, it was supposed to be the root plus probably the plus, in the case of past, or in the sense of future, il. However, again, I never got there. So in practice, the present tense was the noun root, and the past tense was the root plus the future the root plus il. Moving forward, looking at aspect. I wanted to have a cessative and a continuative case, and the idea I had was pretty nifty. I figured cessative would be derived from the word for sunset, and the continuative would be derived from day. And the idea would be, like if you had the example, running. For the cessative, I have stopped running. It would be more like a construction of the sun has set on my running. For the continuative, it would be I am running all day, or I do run all day. That would be the feeling behind it. In practice, the continuative was derived from day, but it was derived from an older version of day, and I ended up dropping a consonant. The cessative was perhaps just derived from the word for stop. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't show up very often in what little bit I've done, so there's that. But again, this is why we have goals, and this is why we try. I also wanted to have two forms of modality, both of them being imperative, but one of them being considered urgent or polite, and the other one considered more of a could you please type of situation. So the urgent imperative only for the second person, so this is something you can only say to a human according to the grammatical rules of the language. It is derived from the first person version of the verb plus will or desire. I will you to, I desire you to. And you take the verb root or whatever form of the root you have and add ofer. The imperative is pretty close. It's ofs, and that's difficult for me to say the way that I plan it to, but I like putting in difficult bits because it makes you practice a little bit more. Now here's the thing, whenever we look at verbs, you may have noticed that I actually had some constructions going on that are very simplistic. That's exactly what they are. They are simplistic, and I never evolved them past that. Moreover, I don't know what order you're supposed to put these in if you wanted to have a past cessative but also urgent for some reason. It's just a thing that I never got around to. And the last note I'm going to make on verbs is I wanted to have applicative valency. That way, verbs, objects could be promoted to indirect or to direct objects from indirect, or the direct objects be promoted to subjects. And I wanted that because I was reading a book and decided that it would be a good idea to put it in there. And then again, I never fleshed it out. So thank you for listening to me. Let me know what you think I did well. Let me know what you think I need to improve on. And yes, I know finishing the language is probably going to be a very important first step next time. And as always, I hope to see you again real soon.